Thanks for joining me. More on Texas family violence. This video series, we're focusing on Chapter 17 of the Code of Criminal Procedure and emergency protective orders that are issued by JPs, magistrates, sitting judges that are below the elected district and county court at law judges, and they're there to be a stopgap, to have a bridge order to protect victims of violence in situations where a defendant, a suspect is arrested on suspicion of family violence. That hearing can be held without them. The order can be signed without anybody saying anything, right? It's just law enforcement talks to judge makes a discretionary call or a mandatory call as to whether to issue an order of emergency protection. The discretionaries are for situations of stalking, for assault, but assault not rising to the level of bodily injury, and other kinds of abusive situations, but again, that fall below threat of death or serious bodily injury or actual injury, what have you. And serious injury cases, serious threat cases, gun cases, things like that, mandatory that an emergency protective order is going to be issued. And then the other ones, like I said, are discretionary. The court may or may not, but in my experience, it's just going to happen. So what does that mean if you're ever faced with that situation? Well, if you're the victim, you need to make sure you have a copy of that, and you need to make sure that anywhere that the offender keeps guns, like at relatives' houses or what have you, down at the deer lease, you need to make sure that there's some awareness that there's been an emergency protective order and that person is at least temporarily prohibited from possessing a firearm or using their concealed handgun license. So it's not a permanent finding, it's just a temporary protection while the case gets sorted out, and it's there to prevent further violence. But family violence in Texas is defined very broadly. There's a statute that's paragraphs long, and it defines family violence as a mental abuse, physical abuse, manipulation of children and loved ones in an abusive manner that destroys their mindset. This is a very broad statute meant to give as much legal protection as possible to our citizens, because we know that family violence is a huge problem. 50% of police involved shootings, if memory serves, are responding to family violence. So when an officer is taking rounds, it generally involves some situation of family violence. Unpopular, popular, don't care. What I'm getting at is there's a signal, and the legislature in Austin, loud and clear, family violence is dangerous. Family violence leads to escalating violence, and these emergency protective orders are put in place to protect the victims, the children, the spouses, what have you, from family violence. And it's not always, the male who's the abuser. That's just as likely to happen on the flip side, where the spouses are being abusive to each other, or mother is being abusive to father, and the kids are witnessing that kind of abuse. That can be enforced just as harshly on one spouse, on one gender, as the other. So don't think for a second that this only applies on a one-way street. It goes both ways. I've seen it applied both ways. And the biggest thing about it is that when you have this happen in your case, it does give a huge leg up to the party who is the alleged victim of family violence, and it puts the other side with a huge step down, because there's already been a preliminary emergency protective order issues, which means when we're talking about moving that needle to a final finding of family violence, which could prevent you from ever enjoying your Second Amendment rights again, you've already got a step in the wrong direction. If an EPO under an emergency protective order under Chapter 17 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, if one's been issued, that's already a step in the wrong direction. So things to consider, things to be aware of. Doesn't mean that there's a final ruling, doesn't mean there's a final finding, doesn't mean there's not a way to get through that process, but you need to be extra careful, because if that occurred, whoever the alleged offender is, whoever the alleged violent person is, is probably under bond conditions, and then they're under this emergency protective order. And if they violate it, I've literally seen it where the violation was the spouse reconciled with the other spouse who was under an emergency protective order, agreed to take that spouse to a hospital and treatment facility to clean up, the behavior, and the next thing you know, we got another charge. So these are sad things. They are nothing to be trifled with, and when you're under an EPO, you've got to strictly follow those orders. Anyway, more to come on that. Please like, subscribe, and share. Leave me a question or comment. I'll get back to you in a direct video message or both.